Book I, Chapters 11 and 12 of The Fatal Three by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Beginning of Doubt. Enderby church clock struck 6. They heard every chime, slow and clear in the summer stillness, as they sat in the broad shadow of the cedar, silent all three. It seemed as if the striking of the clock were the breaking of a spell. "So late!" exclaimed Castellani in a cheery voice, "and I promised Mrs. Hillersdon to be back in time to drive to Romsey for the evening service. The old Abbey Church of Romsey, she tells me, is a thing to dream about. There is no 8 o'clock dinner at Riverdale on Sundays. Every one goes to church somewhere, and we sup at 9:30, and after supper there is sometimes extempore prayer, and sometimes there are charades or dumb crambo. C'est selon. When the Prince was there they had dumb crambo. Good bye. I am almost ashamed to ask if I may ever come again, after having bored you for such an unconscionable time." He had the easiest air possible, and seemed totally unconscious of any embarrassment caused by his allusions to the past ; and yet in both faces, as he looked from one to the other, he must have seen the strongest indications of trouble. Mrs. Greswold murmured something to the effect that she would be glad to see him at any time, a speech obviously conventional and unmeaning. Mr. Greswold rose hastily and accompanied him to the hall door, where the cart still waited for him, the groom fixed as a statue of despondency. Mr. Castellani was inclined to be loquacious to the last. Greswold was brief almost to incivility. He stood watching the light cart roll away, and then slowly went back to the garden and to his seat under the cedar. He seated himself without a word, looking earnestly at his wife, whose drooping head and fixed attitude told of deepest thought. So they sat for some minutes in dead silence, Cassandra licking her master's pendant hand, as he leaned forward with his elbow on his knee, infinitely sorry for him. Mildred was the first to break that silence. " George, why did you not tell me," she began in a low faltering voice, " that I was not your first wife ? What reason could there be for concealment between you and me ? I so trusted you. I so loved you. Nothing you could have told would have changed me." " Dearest, there was one reason, and a powerful one," answered George Greswold firmly, meeting the appealing look of her eyes with a clear and steady gaze. " My first marriage is a sad remembrance for me, full of trouble. I did not care to tell you that miserable story, to call a dreaded ghost out of the grave of the past. My first marriage was the one great sorrow of my life, but it was only an episode in my life. It left me as lonely as it found me. There are very few who know anything about it. I am sorry that young man should have come here to trouble us with his uninvited reminiscences. For my own part, I cannot remember ever having seen his face before." " I am sorry you should have kept such a secret from me," said Mildred. " It would have been so much wiser to have been candid. Do you think I should not have respected your sad memories ? You had only to say to me, such things were, but let us not talk of them. It would have been more manly. It would have been kinder to me." " Say that I was a coward if you like that I am still a coward where those memories are concerned," said Greswold. The look of agony in his face melted her in a moment. She threw herself on her knees beside his chair, she and the dog fawning upon him together. " Forgive me, dearest," she pleaded. " I will never speak to you of this again. Women are so jealous of the past most of all." " Is that all ?" he said. " God knows you have little need. Let us say no more, Mildred. The past is past. Neither you nor I can alter it. Memory is inexorable. God Himself cannot change it." " I will contrive that Mr. Castellani shall not come here again, George, if you object to see him." " Pray don't trouble yourself. I would not have such a worm suppose that he could be obnoxious to me." " Tell me what you think of him," she asked in a lighter tone, anxious to bring back the easy mood of everyday life. " He seems very clever, and he is rather handsome." " What do I think of the trumpet ash on the verandah yonder ? A beautiful parasite, which will hold on anywhere in the sunshine. Mr. Castellani is of the same family, I take it. Studies his own interests first, and chooses his friends afterwards. He will do admirably for Riverdale." " He plays divinely. His touch transformed my piano." " He looks the kind of man who would play the piano. said Greswold, with ineffable contempt, looking down at his own sunburnt hands, hardened by exposure to all weathers, broadened by handling gun and punt pole, and by half a dozen other forms of outdoor exercise. " However, I have no objection to him, if he serves to amuse you and Pamela." He spoke with a kind of weary indifference, as of a man who cared for very little in life ; and then he rose slowly, took up his stick, and strolled off to the shrubbery. Pamela appeared on the following afternoon with boxes, bags, music books, raquettes, and parasols, in a proportion which gave promise of a long visit. She had asked, as a tremendous favour, to be allowed to bring Box, otherwise Fitz Box, her fox terrier, son of Sir Henry Mountford's Box, great grandson of Brockenhurst Joe, through that distinguished animal's daughter, Lyndhurst Jessie, and on the paternal side a lineal descendant of Mr. Murchison's Cracknel. " I hope you won't mind very much," she wrote, " but it would be death to him if I were to leave him behind. To begin with, his brother Fitz Cox, who has a villainous temper, would inevitably kill him ; and besides that, he would pine to death at not sleeping in my room at night, which he has done ever since he was a puppy. If you will let me bring him, I will answer for his good manners, and that he shall not be a trouble to any one." The descendant of Brockenhurst Joe rushed out into the garden, and made a lightning circuit of lawn and shrubberies while his young mistress was kissing her aunt Mildred, as she called her uncle's wife, in the fulness of her affection. " It is so very good of you to have me, and I am so delighted to come," she said. Mildred would have preferred that she were anywhere else, yet could not help feeling kindly to her. She was a frank, bright looking girl, with brown eyes and almost flaxen hair. A piquant contrast, for the hair was genuine, and carried out in the eyebrows, which were only a shade darker. Her complexion was fair to transparency, and she had just enough soft rosy bloom to light up the delicate skin. Her nose was slightly retrousse, her mouth was a little wider than she herself approved, and her teeth were perfection. She had a charming figure of the plump order, but its plumpness was a distress to her. " Don't you think I get horribly stout ?" she asked Mildred, when she was sitting at tea in the garden presently. " You may be a little stouter than you were at 16, perhaps, but not at all too stout." " O, but I am. I know it, I feel it. Don't endeavour to spare my feelings, aunt. It is useless. I know I am fat. Rosalind says I ought to marry, but I tell her it's absurd. How can anybody care for me now I am fat ? They would only want my money if they asked me to marry them," concluded Pamela, clinging to the plural. " My dear Pamela, do you wish me to tell you that you are charming, and all that you ought to be ?" asked Mildred, laughing. " O, no, no. I don't want you to spare my feelings. Everybody spares one's feelings. One grows up in ignorance of the horror of one's appearance, because people will spare one's feelings. And then one sees oneself in a strange glass. Or a boy in the street says something, and one knows the worst. I think I know the worst about myself. That is one comfort. How lovely it is here !" said Pamela, with a sudden change of mood, glancing at Mildred with a little pathetic look as she remembered the childish figure that must be for ever missing from that home picture. " I am so glad to be with you," she murmured softly, nestling up to Mildred's side as they sat together on a rustic bench. " Let me be useful to you. Let me be a companion to you, if you can." " You shall be both, dear." " How good to say that. And you won't mind Box ?"" Not in the least if he will be amiable to Kassandra." " He will. He has been brought up among other dogs. We are a very doggy family at the Hall." " Would you think he was worth 150 guineas ?" asked Pamela, with ill concealed pride, as the scion of illustrious progenitors came up and put his long lean head in her hand, and conversed with her in a series of expressive snorts, as if it were a conversational code. " I hardly know what constitutes perfection in a fox terrier." " No more do I, but I know he is perfect. He is said to be the image of Cracknel, only better. I tremble when I think that my possession of him hangs by a thread. He might be stolen at any moment." " You must be careful." " Yes, I cannot be too careful. Here comes Uncle George," said Pamela, rising and running to meet Mr. Greswold. " O, Uncle George, how altered you are !" She was always saying the wrong thing, after the manner of impulsive girls, and she was quick witted enough to discover her mistake the instant after. Happily the dogs furnished a ready diversion. She introduced Box, and expatiated upon his grand qualities. She admired and made friends with Kassandra, and then settled down almost as lightly as a butterfly, in spite of her plumpness, on a Japanese stool, to take her teacup from Mildred's hands. She was perfectly at her ease by this time, and told her uncle and aunt all about her sister Rosalind and Rosalind's husband, Sir Henry Mountford, whom she summed up lightly as a nice old thing and no end of fun. It was easy to divine from her discourse that Rainham Hall was not an especially intellectual atmosphere, not a school of advanced thought, or of any other kind of thought. Pamela's talk was of tennis, yachting, fishing, and shooting, and of the people who shared in those sports. She seemed to belong to a world in which nobody ever sat down except to eat, or stayed indoors except under stress of weather. " I hear you have all manner of clever people in your neighbourhood," she said by and by, having told all she had to tell about Rainham. " Have we ?" asked Greswold, smiling at her intensity. " Yes, at Riverdale. They do say the author of Nepenthe is staying there, and that he is not a Roman cardinal, or an English statesman, but almost a young man, an Italian by birth, and very handsome. I would give worlds to see him." " It is not unlikely you may be gratified without giving anything," answered her uncle. " Mr. Castellani was here yesterday afternoon, and threatened to repeat his visit." " Castellani ! Yes, that is the name I heard. What a pretty name ! And what is he like ? Do tell me all about him, Aunt Mildred." She turned to the woman as the more likely to give her a graphic description. The average man is an undescribing animal. Mildred made an effort at self command before she spoke. Castellani counted for but little in her recent trouble. His revelation had been an accident, and its effect entirely dissociated from him. Yet the very thought of the man troubled her, and the dread of seeing him again was like a physical pain. " I do not know what to say about his appearance," she answered presently, slowly fanning herself with a great scarlet Japanese fan, pale and cool looking in her plain white gown with its black ribbons. The very picture of domestic peace, one would suppose, judging by externals only. " I suppose there are people who would think him handsome." " Don't you, aunt ?"" No. I don't like the colour of his eyes or of his hair. They are of that reddish brown which the Venetian painters are so fond of, but which always gives me an idea of falsehood and treachery. Mr. Castellani is a very clever man, but he is not a man whom I could ever trust." " How nice !" cried Pamela, her face radiant with enthusiasm. " A creature with red brown hair, and eyes with a depth of falsehood in them. That is just the kind of man who might be the author of Nepenthe. If you had told me he was stout and rosy cheeked, with pepper and salt whiskers, and a fine benevolent head, I would never have opened his book again." " You seem to admire this Nepenthe prodigiously," said her uncle, looking at her with a calmly critical air. " Is it because the book is the fashion, or from your own unassisted appreciation of it ? I did not think you were a bookish person." " I'm not," cried Pamela. " I am a mass of ignorance. I don't know anything about science. I don't know the name of a single butterfly. I don't know one toadstool from another. But when I love a book it is a passion with me. My Keats has tumbled to pieces, my Shelley is disgracefully dirty. I have read Nepenthe 6 times, and I am waiting for the cheap edition to keep it under my pillow. It has made me an agnostic." " Do you know the dictionary meaning of that word ?"" I don't think I do ; but I know I am an agnostic. Nepenthe has unsettled all my old beliefs. If I had read it 4 years ago I should have refused to be confirmed. I am dying to know the author." " You like unbelievers, then," said Mr. Greswold. " I adore men who dare to doubt, who are not afraid to stand apart from their fellow men." " On a bad eminence ?"" Yes, on a bad eminence. What a sweet expression ! I can never understand Goethe's Gretchen." " Why not ?"" How could she have cared for Faust when she had the privilege of knowing Mephistopheles ?" Pamela Ransome had established herself in her pretty bedroom and dressing room, and had supervised her maid while she unpacked and arranged all her belongings before dinner time. She came down to the drawing room at 8:45, as thoroughly at her ease as if she had lived half her life at Enderby Manor. She was a kind of visitor who gives no trouble, and who drops into the right place instinctively. Mildred Greswold felt cheered by her presence, in spite of that ever recurrent pang of memory which associated all young bright things with the sweet girl child who should have grown to womanhood under that roof, and who was lying a little way off, under the ripening berries of the mountain ash, and in the deep shadow of a century old yew. They were very quiet in the drawing room after dinner. Greswold reading in a nook apart, by the light of his own particular lamp. his wife bending over an embroidery frame in her corner near the piano, where she had her own special dwarf bookcase in her work basket, and the Bonheur du Jour, at which she sometimes wrote letters, her own little table scattered with old family miniatures by Angelica Kauffman, Causeway and Ross, and antique watches in enamelled cases, and boxes of porcelain and gold and silver, every one of which had its history. Every woman who lives much at home has some such corner where the very atmosphere is full of home thoughts. She asked her niece to play, and to go on playing as long as she liked ; and Pamela, pleased with the touch of the Broadwood Grand, rang the changes upon Chopin, Schumann, Raff, and Brahms, choosing those compositions which least jarred upon the atmosphere of studious repose. Mildred's needle moved slowly as she sat in her low chair, with her hands in the lamplight and her face in shadow, moved very slowly, and then stopped altogether, and the white hands lay idle in her lap, and the embroidery frame with its half finished group of azaleas slid from her knee to the ground. She was thinking of that one subject which had possessed her thoughts since yesterday afternoon, which had kept her awake through the brief darkness of the summer night, and in the slow hours betwixt dawn and 7 o'clock, when the entrance of the maid with the early cup of tea marked the beginning of the daily routine. In all those hours her thoughts had revolved round that one theme with an intolerable recurrence. It was of her husband's first marriage, she thought, and of his motive for silence about that marriage. That he who, in the whole course of their wedded lives, had been the very spirit of single-minded candour, should yet have suppressed this all-important event in his past history, was a fact in itself so startling and mysterious that it might well be the focus of a wife's troubled thoughts. He could not so have acted without some all-sufficient reason. And what manner of reason could that have been which had influenced him to conduct so entirely at variance with his own character? What was there in the history of that marriage which had sealed his lips, which made it horrible to him to speak about it, even when fair dealing with the girl who was to be his wife should have constrained frankness? Had he been cursed with a wicked wife, some beautiful creature who had caught his heart in her toils, as a cat catches a bird, and had won him only to betray and to dishonour him? Had she blighted his life, branded him with the shame of a forsaken husband? And then a hideous dread floated across her mind. What if that first wife were still living, divorced from him? Had she, Mildred Fausset, severely trained in the strictest principles of the Anglican Church, taught her creed by an ascetic who deemed divorce unchristian and an abomination, and who had always refused to marry those who had been divorced, had she, in whose life and mind religion and duty were as one feeling and one principle, had she been trapped into a union with a man whose wife yet lived, and in the sight of God was yet one with him, a wife who might crawl penitent to his feet some day, and claim him as her own again by the right of tears and prayers and a soul cleansed from sin? Such a sinner must have some hold, some claim even to the last, upon the man who once was her husband, who once swore to cherish her and cleave to her, of whom it had once been said, "And they two shall be one flesh." No, again and again, no. She could not believe George Greswold capable of such deep dishonour as to have concealed the existence of a divorced wife. No. The reason for that mysterious silence must be another reason than this. She had sinned against him, it might be, and had died in her sin, under circumstances too sad to be told without infinite pain. And he, who had never in her experience shown himself wanting in moral courage, had in this one crisis of his life acted as the coward acts. He had kept silence where conscience should have constrained him to speak. And then the wife's vivid fancy conjured up the image of that other wife. Her jealous fears depicted that wife of past years as a being to be loved and remembered until death, beautiful, fascinating, gifted with all the qualities that charm mankind. " He can never care for me as he once cared for her," Mildred told herself. " She was his first love." His first, the first revelation of what love means to the passionate heart of youth. What a world there is in that ! Mildred remembered how a new life began for her with the awakening of her love for George Greswold. What a strange sweet enchantment, what an intoxicating gladness which glorified the whole face of nature ! The river and the reedy islets, and the pollard windows and the autumn sunsets, things so simple and familiar, had all taken new colours in that magical dawn of her first love. She, that unknown woman, had been George Greswold's first love, Mildred envied her that brief life, whose sole distinction was to have been loved by him. " Why do I imagine a mystery about her ?" she argued, after long brooding. " The only secret was that he loved her as he could never love me, and he feared to tell me as much lest I should refuse the remnant of a heart. It was out of kindness to me that he kept silence. It would have pained me too much to know how she had been loved. She knew that her husband was a man of exceeding sensitiveness. She knew him capable of almost womanlike delicacy. Was it altogether unnatural that such a man should have held back the history of his first marriage, with its passionate love, its heart broken ending, from the enthusiastic girl who had given him all her heart, and to whom he could give so little in return ? "He may have seen how I loved him, and may have married me half out of pity," she said to herself finally, with unspeakable bitterness. Yet, if this were so, could they have been so happy together, so completely united, save in that one secret of the past, that one dark regret which had revealed itself from time to time in an agonizing dream ? He had walked that dark labyrinth of sleep alone with his sorrow ; there she could not follow him. She remembered the awful sound of those broken sentences, spoken to shadows in a land of shadow. She remembered how acutely she had felt his remoteness as he sat up in bed, pale as death, his eyes open and fixed, his lips muttering. He and the dead were face to face in the halls of the past. She had no part in his life or in his memory. CHAPTER XII. SHE CANNOT BE UNWORTHY. Mr. Castellani did not wait long before he availed himself of Mrs. Greswold's permission to repeat his visit. He appeared on Friday afternoon at the orthodox hour of 3:30, when Mildred and her niece were sitting in the drawing room, exhausted by a long morning at Salisbury, where they had explored the cathedral, and lunched in the Close with a clever friend of George Greswold's, who had made his mark on modern literature. " I adore Salisbury Close," said Pamela, as she looked through the old fashioned window to the old fashioned garden. " It reminds me of Honoria." She did not deem it necessary to explain what Honoria she meant, presuming a universal acquaintance with Coventry Patmore's gentle heroine. The morning had been sultry, the homeward drive long, and both ladies were resting in comfortable silence, each with a book, when Castellani was announced. Mildred received him rather coldly, trying her uttermost to seem thoroughly at ease. She introduced him to her niece, Miss Ransome. " The daughter of the late Mr. Randolph Ransome, and the sister of Lady Mountford ?" Castellani inquired presently, when Pamela had run out on the lawn to speak to Box. " Yes. You seem to know everybody's belongings." " Why not ? It is the duty of every man of the world, more especially of a foreigner. I know Mr. Ransome's place in the Sussex Weald, a very fine property, and I know that the two ladies are co heiresses, but that the Sussex estate is to descend to the eldest son of the elder daughter, or, failing male issue there, to the son of the younger. Lady Mountford has a baby son, I believe." " Your information is altogether correct." " Why should it be otherwise ? Mr. Hillersdon and his wife discussed the family history to day at luncheon, apropos to Miss Ransome's appearance in Romsey Church at the Saint's Day service yesterday. His frankness apologised for his impertinence, and he was a foreigner, which seems always to excuse a great deal. Pamela came back again, after rescuing Box from a rough and tumble game with Kassandra. She looked rosy and breathless and very pretty, in her pale blue gown and girlish sash flying in the wind, and flaxen hair fluffed into a feathery pile on the top of her head, and honest brown eyes. She resumed her seat in the deep old window behind the end of the piano, and made believe to go on with some work which she took in a tangled heap from a very untidy basket. Already Pamela had set the sign of her presence upon the drawing rooms at Enderby, a trail of heterogeneous litter which was part of her individuality. Screened by the piano, she was able to observe Castellani as he stood, leaning over the large central ottoman, with his knee on the cushioned seat, talking to Mrs. Greswold. He was the author of Nepenthe. It was in that character he interested her. She looked at him with the thought of his book full in her mind. It was one of those half mad, wholly artificial compositions which delight girls and young men, and which are just clever enough, and have just enough originality to get talked about and written about by the cultured few. It was a love story, ending tragically ; a story of ruined lives and broken hearts, told in the autobiographical form, with a studied avoidance of all conventional ornament, which gave an air of reality where all was inherently false. Pamela thought it must be Castellani's own story. She fancied she could see the traces of those heart-breaking experiences, those crushing disappointments in his countenance, in his bearing even, and in the tones of his voice, which gave an impression of mental fatigue, as of a man worn out by a fatal passion. The story of Nepenthe was as old as the hills, or at least as old as the Boulevard des Capucines and the Palais Royal. It was the story of a virtuous young man's love for an unvirtuous woman, the story of Demetrius and Lamia, the story of a man's demoralization under the influence of incarnate falsehood, of the gradual lapse from good to evil, the gradual extinction of every belief and every scruple, the final destruction of a soul. The wicked siren was taken, her victim was left, but left to expiate that miserable infatuation by an after life of misery, left without a joy in the present or a hope in the future. " He looks like it," thought Pamela, remembering that final chapter. Mrs. Greswold was putting a few slow stitches into the azalea leaves in her embroidery frame, and listening to Mr. Castellani with an air of polite indifference. " Do you know that Riverdale is quite the most delightful house I have ever stayed in ?" he said, " and I have stayed in a great many. And do you know that Mrs. Hillersdon is heartbroken at your never having called upon her ?"" I am sorry so small a matter should touch Mrs. Hillersdon's heart." " She feels it intensely. She told me so yesterday. Perfect candour is one of the charms of her character. She is as emotional and as transparent as a child. Why have you not called on her ?"" You forget that Riverdale is 7 miles from this house." " Does not your charity extend so far ? Are people who live 7 miles off beyond the pale ? I think you must visit a little further afield than 7 miles. There must be some other reason." " There is another reason, which I had rather not talk about." " I understand. You consider Mrs. Hillersdon a person not to be visited. Long ago, when you were a child in the nursery, Mrs. Hillersdon was an undisciplined and experienced girl, and the world used her hardly. Is that old history never to be forgotten ? Men who know it all have agreed to forget it. Why should women who only know a fragment so obstinately remember ? I know nothing, and remember nothing, about Mrs. Hillersdon. My friends are, for the most part, those of my husband's choice, and I pay no visits without his approval. He does not wish me to visit at Riverdale. You have forced me to give you a plain answer, Mr. Castellani." " Why not ? Plain truth is always best. I am sorry Mr. Greswold has interdicted my charming friend. You can have no idea how excellent a woman she is, or how admirable a wife. Tom Hillersdon might have searched the country from border to border, and not have found as good a woman. Looked at as the best woman best calculated to make him happy. And what delightful people she has brought about him. One of the most interesting men I have ever met arrived yesterday, and is to preach the hospital sermon at Romsey next Sunday. He is an old friend of yours." " A clergyman, and an old friend of mine, at Riverdale ?"" A man of ascetic life and exceptional culture. I never heard any man talk of Dante better than he talked to me last night in the moonlight stroll on the terrace, while the other men were in the smoking room." " Surely you do not mean Mr. Canceller, the vicar of St. Elizabeth's, Parchment Street ?"" That is the man, Clement Canceller, vicar of St. Elizabeth's. He looks like a mediaeval monk just stepped out of one of Bellini's altar pieces." " He is the noblest, most unselfish of men," said Mildred warmly. " He has given his life to doing good among rich and poor. It is so long since I have seen him. We have asked him to Enderby very often, but he has always been too busy to come. And to think that he should be in this neighbourhood and I know nothing about it. And to think that he should go to Riverdale rather than come here." " He had hardly an option. It was Mrs. Hillersdon who asked him to preach on Hospital Sunday. She extorted a promise from him 3 months ago in London. The Vicar of Romsey was enchanted. ' You are the cleverest woman I know,' he said. ' No one else could have got me such a great gun.' " A great gun Mr. Cancellor a great gun ! I can only think of him as I knew him when I was 12 years old. A tall, thin young man, in a very shabby coat. He was curate at St. Elizabeth's then. Very gaunt and hollow cheeked, but with such a sweet smile. He used to come twice a week to teach me the history of the Bible and the Church. He made me love both." " He is gaunt and hollow cheeked still, tall and bony and sallow, and he still wears a shabby coat." You will not find much difference in him, I fancy, only so many more years of hard work and self-sacrifice, ascetic living and nightly study. A man to know Dante as he does must have given years of his life to that one poet, and I am told that in literature Cancellor is an all round man. His monograph on Pascal is said to be the best of a brilliant series of such studies." " I hope he will come to see his old pupil before he leaves the neighbourhood." " He means to do so. He was talking of it yesterday evening asking Mrs. Hillersdon if she was intimate with you. So awkward for poor Mrs. Hillersdon." " I shall be very glad to see him again." " May I drive him over to tea to morrow afternoon ?"" He will be welcome here at any time." " Or with any one ? If Mrs. Hillersdon were to bring him, would you still refuse to receive her ?"" I have never refused to receive her. We have met and talked to each other on public occasions. If Mr. Cancellor likes her she cannot be unworthy." " May she come with him to morrow ?" persisted Castellani. " If she likes," faltered Mildred, wondering that any woman could so force an entrance to another woman's house. She did not know that it was by such forced entrances Mrs. Hillersdon had made her way into society until some of the best houses in London had been opened to her. " If you are not in a hurry to leave us, I know my niece would much like to hear you play," she said, feeling that the talk about Riverdale had been dull work for Pamela. Miss Ransome murmured assent. " If you will play something of Beethoven's," she entreated. " Do you object to Mozart ?" he asked, forgetting his depreciation of the valet musician's son a few days before. " I feel more in the humour for that prince of dramatists. I will give you the supper in Don Giovanni. You shall see Leporello trembling. You shall hear the tramp of ghostly feet." And then, improvising upon a familiar theme, he gave his own version of that wonderful scene, and that music so played conjured up a picture as vivid as ever opera house furnished to an enthralled audience. Pamela listened in silent rapture. What a God gifted creature this was, who had so deeply moved her by his pen, who moved her even more intensely by that magical touch upon the piano. When he had played those last crashing chords which consigned the profligate to his doom, he waited for a minute or so, and then softly, as if almost unawares, in mere absent minded idleness, his hands wandered into the staccato accompaniment of the serenade ; and with the finest tenor Mildred had heard since she had heard Sims Reeves, he sang those delicate and dainty phrases with which the seducer woos his last divinity. He rose from the piano at the close of that lovely air, smiling at his hearers. " I had no idea that you were a singer as well as a pianist," said Mildred. " You forget that music is my native tongue. My father taught me to play before he taught me to read, and I knew harmony before I knew my alphabet. I was brought up in the house of a man who lived only for music, to whom all stringed instruments were as his mother tongue. It was by a caprice that he made me play the piano, which he rarely touched himself." " He must have been a great genius," said Pamela with girlish fervour. " Alas, no. He just missed greatness, and he just missed genius. He was a highly gifted man, various, capricious, volatile ; and he married a woman with just enough money to ruin him. Had he been obliged to earn his bread he might have been great. Who can say ? Hunger is the slave driver with his whip of steel, who peoples the Valhalla of nations. If Homer had not been a beggar, as well as blind, we might have had no story of Troy. Good bye, Mrs. Greswold. Good bye," shaking hands with Pamela. " I may bring my hostess to morrow ?"" I suppose so," Mildred answered feebly, wondering what her husband would think of such an invasion. Yet, if Clement Canceller, who to Mildred's mind had always seemed the ideal Christian priest, if he could tolerate and consort with her, could she, Mildred Greswold, persist in the Pharisee's part, and hold herself aloof from this neighbour to whose good works and kindly disposition many voices had testified in her hearing ? CHAPTERS XI and XII. Book I, Chapter 13 of The Fatal Three by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER XIII. Shall she be less than another? It was all in good faith that Clement Canceller had gone to Riverdale. He had not gone there for the flesh pots of Egypt. He was a man of severely ascetic habits, who ate and drank as temperately as a disciple of that old faith of the East which is gaining a curious influence upon our new life of the West. For him the gratification of the senses, soft raiment, artistic furniture, thoroughbred horses and luxurious carriages, palm houses and orchid houses offered no temptation. He stayed in Mrs. Hillersdon's house because he was her friend upon the broadest and soundest basis on which friendship could be built. He knew all that was to be known about her. He knew her frailties of the past, her virtues in the present, her exalted hope in the future. From her own lips he had heard the story of Louise Lorraine's life. She had extenuated nothing. She had not withheld from him either the foulness of her sins or their number. Nay, it may be that she had in somewise exaggerated the blackness of those devils whom he, Clement Canceller, had cast out from her, enhancing by just so much the magnitude of the miracle he had wrought. She had held back nothing; but over every revelation she had contrived to spread that gloss which a clever woman knows how to give to the tale of her own wrong doing. In every incident of that evil career she had contrived to show herself more sinned against than sinning; the fragile victim of overmastering wickedness in others, the martyr of man's treachery and man's passion, the sport of fate and circumstance. Had Mr. Canceller known the world he lived in half as well as he knew the world beyond, he would hardly have believed so readily in the lady who had been Louise Lorraine. But he was too single-minded to doubt a repentant sinner whose conversion from the ways of evil had been made manifest by so many good works, and such unflagging zeal in the exercises of the Anglican Church. Parchment Street, Grosvenor Square, is one of the fashionable streets of London, and St. Elizabeth's Parchment Street had gradually developed, in Clement Canceller's incumbency, into one of the most popular tabernacles at the West End. He whose life desire had been to carry the lamp of the faith into dark places, to be the friend and teacher of the friendless and the untaught, found himself almost in spite of himself a fashionable preacher, and the delight of the cultured, the wealthy, and the aristocratic. In his parish of St. Elizabeth's there was plenty of work for him to do, plenty of that work which he had chosen as the mission that had been given to him to fulfil. Behind those patrician streets, where only the best appointed carriages drew up, where only the best dressed footmen ever pulled the bells or rattled long peals on high art knockers, there were some of the worst slums in London, and it was in those slums that half Mr. Canceller's life was spent. In narrow alleys between Oxford and Wigmore streets, and in the intricate purlieus of Marylebone Lane, the Anglican priest had ample scope for his labour, a vineyard waiting for the husbandman. And in the labyrinth hidden in the heart of West End London, Mr. Canceller's chief coadjutor for the last 20 years had been Louise Hillersdon. Thoroughness was the supreme quality of Mrs. Hillersdon's mind. Nothing stopped her. It was this temper which had given her distinction in the days when princes were her cupbearers and diamonds her daily tribute. There had been other women as beautiful, other women as fascinating, but there was not one who with beauty and fascination combined the audacity and resolution of Louise Lorraine. When Louise Lorraine took possession of a man's wits and a man's fortune, that man was doomed. He was as completely gone as the lemon in the iron squeezer. A twist of the machine, and there is nothing left but broken rind and crushed pulp. A season of infatuation, and there was nothing left of Mrs. Lorraine's admirer but shattered health and an overdrawn banking account. Estates, houses, friends, position, good name, all dropped away from the man whom Louise Lorraine brayed in her mortar. She spoke of him next season with half contemptuous pity. "Did I know Sir Theodore Barrymore? Yes, he used to come to my parties sometimes. A nice fellow enough, but such a terrible fool." When Louise Lorraine married Tom Hillersdon, and took it into her head to break away altogether from her past career, and to pose before the world as a beautiful Magdalen, she was clever enough to know that, to achieve any place in society, she must have a very powerful influence to help her. She was clever enough to discover that the one influence which a woman in her position could count upon was the influence of the Church. She was beautiful enough and refined enough to win friends among the clergy by the charm of her personality. She was rich enough to secure such friends, and bind them to herself by the splendour of her gifts, by her substantial aid in those good works which are to the priest as the very breath of his life. One man she could win by an organ, another lived only to complete a steeple, the third had been yearning for a decade for that golden hour when the cracked tintinnabulation which now summoned his flock should be exchanged for a fine peal of bells. Such men as these were only too easily won, and the drawing rooms of Mr. Hillerton's house in Park Lane were rarely without the grace of some clerical figure in long frock coat and Roman collar. Clement Canceller was of a sterner stuff, and not to be bought by bell or reredos, rood screen or pulpit. Him Louise Hillersdon won by larger measures. To him she offered all that was spiritual in her nature, and this woman of strange memories was not without spiritual aspirations and real striving after godliness. Clement Canceller was no pious simpleton to be won by sentimental cant and crocodile tears. He knew truth from falsehood, but never in his life been duped by the jingle of false coin. He knew that Mrs. Hillersdon's repentance had the true ring, albeit she was in something still of the earthy. She had worked for him and with him in that wilderness of London as not one other woman in his congregation had ever worked. To the lost of her own sex she had been as a redeeming angel. Wretched women had blessed her with their expiring breath, had died full of hopes that might never have been awakened had not Louise Lorraine sat beside their beds. Few other women had ever so influenced the erring of her sex. She, who had waded deep in the slough of sin, knew how to talk to sinners. Mr. Canceller never forgot her as he had seen her by the bed of death and in the haunts of iniquity. She could never be to him as the herd of women. To the mind of the preacher she had a higher value than 1 in 20 of those women of his flock whose unstained lives had never needed the cleansing of self-sacrifice and difficult works. Thus it was that the Vicar of St. Elizabeth's had never shrunk from acknowledging Mrs. Hillersdon as his personal friend, had never feared to sit at her board or to be seen with her in public. And in the work of Louise Lorraine's rehabilitation Clement Canceller had been a tower of strength. And now this latest mark of friendship, this visit to her country home, and this appearance in the noble old Abbey church at her solicitation, filled her cup of pride. Those starched county people who had shunned her hospitalities were to see that one of the most distinguished preachers in the High Church party had given her his friendship and his esteem. It had been something for her to have the Prince at Riverdale. It was still more to her to have Clement Canceller. Pamela was in a flutter of excitement all Saturday morning, in the expectation of Castellani's reappearance in the afternoon. She had heard Mr. Canceller preach, and was delighted at the idea of seeing him in the pleasant intimacy of afternoon tea. Had there been no such person as Castellani, her spirits would have been on tiptoe at the idea of conversing with the fashionable preacher, of telling him in a reverent undertone of all those deep emotions his eloquence had inspired in her. But the author of Nepenthe possessed just that combination of qualities which commands the admiration of such a girl as Pamela. That exquisite touch on the piano, that perfect tenor voice, that exotic elegance of dress and figure, all had made their mark upon the sensitive plate of a girl's ardent fancy. " If I had pictured to myself the man who wrote Nepenthe, I should have imagined just such a face, just such a style," thought Pamela, quite forgetting that when first she had read the book she had made a very vivid picture of the author altogether the opposite of Cesar Castellani, a dark man, lean as a whipping post, grave as philosophy itself, with sombre black eyes and ebony hair, and a complexion of antique marble. And now she was ready to accept the Italian, sleek, supple, essentially modern in every grace and attribute, in place of that sage of antique mould. She went dancing about with the dogs all the morning, inciting the grave Cassandra to unwonted exertions, running in and out of the drawing room, making an atmosphere of gaiety in the grave old house. Mildred's heart ached as she watched that flying figure in the white gown, youth, health, joyousness personified. " O, if my darling were but here, life might be full of happiness again," she thought. " I should cease to weary myself with wondering about that hidden past." Do what she would, her thoughts still dwelt upon the image of that wife who had possessed George Greswold's heart before her. She knew that he must have loved that other woman whom he had sworn before God's altar to cherish. He was not the kind of man to marry for any motive but a disinterested love. That he had loved passionately, and that he had been wronged deeply, was Mildred's reading of the mystery. There had been a look of agony in his countenance when he spoke of the past that told of a sorrow too deep for words. " He has never loved me as he once loved her," thought Mildred, who out of the wealth of her own love had developed the capacity for that self-torture called jealousy. It seemed to her that her husband had taken pains to avoid the old opportunities of confidential talk since that revelation of last Sunday. He had been more than usually engaged by the business details of his estate, and she fancied that he made the most of all those duties which he used once to perform with the utmost despatch, grudging every hour that was spent away from the home circle. He now complained of the new steward's ignorance, which threw so much extra work upon himself. After jogging on for years in the same groove with a man who knew every rood of my land, and the idiosyncrasies of every tenant, I find it hard work teaching a new man," he told his wife. This sounded reasonable enough, yet she could but think that since Sunday he had studiously avoided being alone with her. If he asked her to drive or walk with him, he secured Pamela's company before the excursion was planned. " We must show you the country," he said to his niece. Mildred told him of the threatened incursion from Riverdale as they sat at luncheon with Pamela. " I hope you don't mind my receiving Mrs. Hillersdon," she said. " No, my dear Mildred, I think it would take a much worse woman than Mrs. Hillersdon to do you any harm, or Pamela either. Whatever her early history may have been, she has made Tom Hillersdon an excellent wife, and she has been a very good friend to the poor. I should not have cared for you to cultivate Mrs. Hillersdon, or the society she brings round her at Riverdale." " Sir Henry says they have people from the music halls," interjected Pamela in an awe stricken voice. " But if Mrs. Hillersdon likes to come here with her clerical star " "Don't call him a star, George. He is highly gifted, and people have chosen to make him the fashion, but he is the most single hearted and simple minded man I ever met. No popularity could spoil him. I feel that if he holds out the hand of friendship to Mrs. Hillersdon, she must be a good woman." " Let her come, Mildred, only don't let her coming open the door to intimacy. I would not have my wife the friend of any woman with a history." " And yet there are histories in most lives, George, and there is sometimes a mystery." She could not refrain from this little touch of bitterness, yet she was sorry the instant she had spoken, deeply penitent, when she saw the look of pain in the thoughtful face opposite her. Why should she wilfully wound him, purposely, needlessly, she who so fondly loved him, whose keenest pain was to think that he had loved any woman upon earth before he loved her? " Will you be at home to help me receive my old friend, George ?" she said, as they rose from the table. " Yes, I will be at home to welcome Canceller, and to protect you from his protegee's influence, if I can." They were all three in the drawing room when the Riverdale party arrived. Mildred and Mrs. Hillersdon met in some wise as old acquaintances, having been thrown together on numerous occasions at hunt balls, charity bazaars, and other public assemblies. Pamela was the only stranger. Although the scandalous romance of Louise Lorraine's career was called ancient history, she was still a beautiful woman. The delicate features, the pure tones of the alabaster skin, and the large Irish gray eyes had been kindly dealt with by time. On the verge of 50, Mrs. Hillersdon might have owned only to 40, had she cared so far to palter with truth. Her charm was, however, now more in a fascinating personality than in the remains of a once dazzling loveliness. There was mind in the keen bright face, with its sharply cut lines, and those traces of intellectual wear which give a new grace, instead of the old one of youthful softness and faultless colouring. The bloom was gone from the peach, the brilliancy of youth had faded from those speaking eyes, but there was all the old sweetness of expression which had made Louise Lorraine's smile irresistible as the song of the Lurlei in the days that were gone. Her dress was perfect, as it had always been from the day when she threw away her last cotton stocking, darned by her own fair hands, and took to dressing like a leader of the great world, and with perhaps even less concern for cost. She dressed in perfect harmony with her age and position. Her gown was of softest black silk, draped with some semi diaphanous fabric and clouded with Chantilly lace. Her bonnet was of the same lace and gauze, and her tapering hand and slender wrist were fitted to perfection in a long black glove, which met a cloud of lace just below the elbow. At a period when almost every woman who wore black glittered with beads and bugles from head to foot, Mrs. Hillersdon's costume was unembellished by a single ornament. The Parisian milliner had known how to obey her orders to the letter when she stipulated " surtout point de jet," and the effect was at once distinguished and refined. Clement Canceller greeted his old pupil with warm friendliness, and meekly accepted her reproaches for all those invitations which he had refused in the past 10 years. " You told me so often that it was impossible for you to come to Enderby, and yet you can go to my neighbour," she said. " My dear Mildred, I went to Riverdale because I was wanted at Romsey." " And do you think you were not wanted at Romsey before to day ? Do you think we should not have been proud to have you preach in our church here People would have flocked from far and wide to hear you. Yes, even to Enderby Church. And you might have aided some good work, as you are going to do to morrow. How clever of Mrs. Hillersdon to know how to tempt you down here." " You may be sure it is not the first time I have tried, Mrs. Greswold," said that lady, with her fascinating smile. " Your influence would have gone further than mine, I daresay, had you taken half as much trouble as I have done." Mr. Rollinson, the curate of Enderby, was announced at this moment. The vicar was a rich man, with another parish in his cure, and his own comfortable vicarage and his brother's family mansion being adjacent to the other church, Enderby saw him but seldom, whereby Mr. Rollinson was a person of much more weight in the parish than the average clerical subaltern. Mildred liked him for his plain sailing Christianity and unfailing kindness to the poor, and she had asked him to tea this afternoon, knowing that he would like to meet Clement Canceller. Castellani looked curiously unlike those three other men, with their grave countenances and unstudied dress. George Greswold roughly clad in shooting jacket and knickerbockers ; the two priests in well worn black. The Italian made a spot of brightness in that sombre assembly, the sunlight touching his hair and moustache with glints of gold, his brown velvet coat and light gray trousers suggestive of the studio rather than of rustic lanes, a gardenia in his buttonhole, a valuable old intaglio fastening his white silk scarf, and withal a half insolent look of amusement at those two priests and the sombre visaged master of the house. He slipped with serpentine grace to the further side of the piano, where he contrived his first tete a tete with Pamela, comfortably sheltered by the great Henri II vase of gloxinias on the instrument. Pamela was shy at first, and would hardly speak ; then, taking courage, told him how she had wondered and wept over Nepenthe, and thereupon they began to talk as if they were two kindred souls that had been kept too long apart by adverse fate, and thrilled with the new delight of union. Round the tea table the conversation was of a graver cast. After a general discussion of the threatening clouds upon the political and ecclesiastical horizon, the talk had drifted to a question which at this time was uppermost in the minds of men. The deceased wife's sister bill had been thrown out by the Upper House during the last session, and everybody had been talking of that debate in which three princes of the blood royal had been attentive auditors. They had recorded their vote on the side of liberty of conscience, but in vain. Time honoured prejudices had prevailed against modern enlightenment. Clement Canceller was a man who would have suffered martyrdom for his faith. He was generous, he was merciful, gentle, self-sacrificing, pure in spirit ; but he was not liberal minded. The old shackles hung heavily upon him. He could not love Wycliffe, and he could not forgive Cranmer. He was an ecclesiastic after the antique pattern. To him the marriage of a priest was a base paltering with the lusts of the flesh, and to him a layman's marriage with a dead wife's sister was unholy and abominable. He had been moved to indignation by the words that had been spoken and the pamphlets that had been written of late upon this question ; and now, carried away by George Greswold's denunciation of that prejudiced majority by which the bill had been rejected, Mr. Canceller gave his indignation full vent, and forgot that he was speaking in a lady's drawing room and before feminine hearers. He spoke of such marriages as unholy and immoral, he spoke of such households as accursed. Mildred listened to him, and watched him wonderingly, scared at this unfamiliar aspect of his character. To her he had ever been the gentlest of teachers. She saw him now pallid with wrath. She heard him breathing words of fire. George Greswold took up the glove, not because he had ever felt any particular interest in this question, but because he hated narrow minded opinions and clerical prejudices. " Why should the sister of his wife be different to a man from all other women ?" he asked. " You may call her different, you may set her apart, you may say she must be to him as his own sister. Her beauty must not touch him, the attractions that fascinate other men must have no influence over him. You may lay this down as a law, civil, canonical, what you will, but the common law of nature will override your clerical code, will burst your shackles of prejudice and tradition. Shall Rachel be withheld from him who was true and loyal to Leah ? She has dwelt in his house as his friend, the favourite and playmate of his children. He has respected her as he would have respected any other of his wife's girl friends ; but he has seen that she was fair. And if God takes the wife, and he, remembering the sweetness of that old friendship and his children's love, turns to her as the one woman who can give him back his lost happiness, is he to be told that this one woman can never be his, because she was the sister of his first chosen ? She has come out of the same stock whose loyalty he has proved, she would bring to his hearth all the old sweet associations. And she would not bring him a second mother-in-law. What a stupendous superiority she would have there," interjected the jovial Rollinson, who had been wallowing in hot buttered cakes and strong tea, until his usually roseate visage had become startlingly rubicund. He was in all things the opposite of the vicar of St. Elizabeth's. He wrote poetry, made puns, played billiards, dined out at all the houses in the neighbourhood that were worth dining at, and was only waiting to marry until Tom Hillersdon should be able to give him a living. Mr. Canceller reproved the ribald jester with a scathing look before he took up the argument against his host. "If this bill were to pass, no virtuous woman could live in the house of a married sister," he said. "That is as much as to say that no honest woman can live in the house of any married man," retorted Greswold hotly. "Do you think if a man is weak enough to fall in love with another woman under his wife's roof, he is less likely to sin because your canonical law stares him in the face, telling him, 'Thou canst never wed her'? That married man who is inconstant to his wife is not influenced by the chances of the future. He is either a bold, bad man, whose only thought is to win the woman whom he loves at any cost of honour or conscience, or he is a weak fool who drifts hopelessly to destruction, and in whom the resolution of to-day yields to the temptation of to-morrow. Neither the bold sinner nor the weak one is influenced by the consideration whether he can or cannot marry the woman he loves under the unlikely circumstance of his wife's untimely death. The man who does so calculate is the one man in so many thousands of men who will poison his wife to clear the way for his new fancy. I don't think we ought to legislate for poisoners. In plain words, if a married man is weak enough or wicked enough to be seduced by the charms of any woman who dwells beneath his roof, he will not be the less likely to fall because the law of the land has made that woman anathema maranatha, or because he has been warned from the pulpit that she is to be to him as his own flesh and blood, no dearer and no less dear than the sister beside whom he grew from infancy to manhood, and whom he has loved all his life, hardly knowing whether she is as beautiful as Hebe, or as hideous as Tisiphone." "You are a disciple of the new learning, Mr. Greswold," Canceller said bitterly. "The learning which breaks down all barriers and annihilates the Creator of all things. The learning which has degraded God from infinite power to infinitesimal insignificance, and which explains the genius of Plato and Shakespeare, Luther and Newton, as the ultimate outcome of an unconscious primeval mist." "I am no Darwinian," replied Greswold coldly, "but I would rather belong to his school of speculative inquiry than to the Calvinism which slew Servetus, or the Romanism which lit the death pile of the Oxford martyrs." Mildred was not more anxious than Mrs. Hillersdon to end a discussion which threatened angry feeling. They looked at each other in an agony, and then, with a sudden inspiration, Mildred exclaimed, "If we could only persuade Mr. Castellani to play to us! We are growing so terribly serious." And then she went to Clement Canceller, who was standing by the open window, and took her place beside him, while Mrs. Hillersdon talked with Pamela and Castellani at the piano. " You know what a privilege it is to me always to hear you talk," she murmured in her sweet subdued voice. " You know how I have followed your teaching in all things. And be assured my husband is no materialist. We both cling to the old faith, the old hopes, the old promises. You must not misjudge him because of a single difference of opinion." " Forgive me, my dear Mildred," replied Canceller, touched by her submission. " I did wrong to be angry. I know that to many good Christians this question of marriage with a sister in law is a stumbling block. I have taken the subject too deeply to heart, perhaps, I, to whom marriage altogether seems outside the Christian priest's horizon. Perhaps I may exaggerate the peril of a wider liberty ; but I, who look upon Henry VIII as the arch enemy of the one vital church, of when he might have been the wise and enlightened reformer, I, who trace his unhallowed union with his brother's widow all the after evils of his career, must needs lift up my voice against a threatened danger." Castellani began Mendelssohn's Wedding March with a triumphant burst that sounded like mockery. Do what the preacher might to assimilate earth to heaven, here there would still be marrying and giving in marriage. After the march Mildred went over to the piano and asked Castellani to sing. He smiled assent, and played the brief symphony to a ballad of Heine, set by Jensen. The exquisite tenor voice, the perfect taste of the singer, held his audience spellbound. They listened in silence, and entreated him to sing again, and then again, till he had sung 4 of these jewel like ballads, and they felt that it was impertinence to ask for more. Mildred had stolen round to her own sheltered corner, half hidden by a group of tall palms. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her head bent. She could not see the singer. She only heard the low pathetic voice, slightly veiled. It touched her like no other voice that she had ever heard since, in her girlhood. She burst into a passion of sobs at first hearing Sims Reeves, when that divine voice touched some hypersensitive chord in her own organization and moved her almost to hysteria. And now, in this voice of the man who of all other men she instinctively disliked, the same tones touched the same chord, and loosened the floodgates of her tears. She sat with streaming eyes, grateful for the sheltering foliage which screened her from observation. She dried her eyes and recovered herself with difficulty when the singer rose from the piano, and Mrs. Hillersdon began to take leave. Mr. Rollinson buttonholed Castellani on the instant. " You sing as if you had just come from the seraphic choir," he said. " You must sing for us on the 7th." " Who are us ?" asked Castellani. " Our concert in aid of the fund for putting a Burne Jones window over the altar." " A concert in Enderby village. Is it to be given at the lock up or in the Pound ?"" It is to be given in this room. Mrs. Greswold has been good enough to allow us the use of her drawing room and her piano. Miss Ransome promises to preside at the buffet for tea and coffee." " It will be glorious fun," exclaimed Pamela. " I shall feel like a barmaid. I have always envied barmaids." " Daudet says there is one effulgent spot in every man's life, one supreme moment when he stands on the mountain top of fortune and of bliss, and from which all the rest of his existence is a gradual descent. I wonder whether that afternoon will be your effulgent spot, Miss Ransome," said Mrs. Hillersdon laughingly. " It will it must. To superintend 2 great urns of tea and coffee almost as nice as those delicious beer engines one sees at Salisbury Station to charge people a shilling for a small cup of tea and 6d. for a penny sponge cake. What splendid fun !"" Will you help us, Mr. Castleton ?" asked the curate, who was not good at names. " Mrs. Greswold has only to command me. I am in all things her slave." " Then she will command you. She does command you," cried the curate. " If you will be so very kind " began Mildred. " I am only too proud to obey you," answered Castellani, with more earnestness than the occasion required, drawing a little nearer to Mildred as he spoke ;" only too glad of an excuse to return to this house." Mildred looked at him with a half frightened expression, and then glanced at Pamela. Did he mean mischief of some kind ? Was this the beginning of an insidious pursuit of that frank girl, whose fortune was quite enough to tempt the casual adventurer ? Of all men I have ever seen he is the last to whom I would entrust a girl's fate, thought Mildred, determined to be very much on her guard against the blandishments of Cesar Castellani. She took the very worst means to ward off danger. She made the direful mistake of warning the girl against the possible pursuer that very evening when they were sitting alone after dinner. " He is a man I would never trust," she said. " No more could I," replied Pamela. " But O, how exquisitely he sings !" and excited at the mere memory of that singing, she ran to the piano and began to pick out the melody of Heine's " Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten," and sang the words softly in her girlish voice, and then slipped away from the piano with a nervous little laugh. " Upon my word, Aunt Mildred, I am traurig myself at the very thought of that exquisite song," she said. " What a gift it is to sing like that ! How I wish I were Cesar Castellani !"" What, when we have both agreed that he is not a good man ?"" Who cares about being good ?" exclaimed Pamela, beside herself. " 3/4 of the people of this world are good ; but to be able to write a book that can unsettle every one's religion, to be able to make everybody miserable when one sings those are gifts that place a man on a level with the Greek gods. If I were Mr. Castellani I should feel like Mercury or Apollo." " Pamela, you frighten me when you rave like that. Remember that, for all we know to the contrary, this man may be a mere adventurer and in every way dangerous." " Why should we think him an adventurer ? He told me all about himself. He told me that his grandfather was under obligations to your grandfather. He told me about his father, the composer, who wrote operas which are known all over Italy, and who died young, like Mozart and Mendelssohn. Genius is hereditary with him. He was suckled upon art. I have no doubt he is bad irretrievably bad," said Pamela with unction. But don't try to persuade me that he is a vulgar adventurer who would try to borrow £5 notes, or a fortune hunter who would try to marry one for one's money," concluded the girl, falling back upon her favourite form of speech. CHAPter 13. Book 1, Chapter 14 of The Fatal Three by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Lifting the Curtain. The charity concert afforded Cesar Castellani just the necessary excuse for going to Enderby Manor House as often as he liked, and for staying there as long as he liked. He was now on a familiar footing. He drove or rode over from Riverdale nearly every day during the 3 weeks that intervened between Mr. Canceller's sermon and the afternoon concert. He made himself the curate's right hand in all the details of the entertainment. He chose the music, he wrote the programme, he sent it to his favourite printer to be printed in antique type upon ribbed paper with ragged edges, a perfect gem in the way of a programme. He scoured the country round in quest of amateur talent, and was much more successful than the curate had been in the same quest. "I'm astounded at your persuading Lady Millborough to show in the daylight," said Rollinson, laughing. "You have the tongue of the serpent to overcome her objection to the glare of the afternoon sun." "Estote prudente sicuti serpentes," said Castellani. "There's a fine old ecclesiastic motto for you. I know Lady Millborough rather dreads the effect of sunlight upon her nacre Bernhardt. She told me that she was never equal to singing in the afternoon. The glare of the sun always gave her a headache. But I assured her in the first place that there should be no glare, that as an artist I abhorred a crude white light, and that it should be my business to see that our concert room was lighted upon purely aesthetic principles. We would have the dim religious light which painters and poets love. In the second place, I assured her that she had as fine a contralto as Madame Alboni, on whose knees I had often sat as a child, and who gave me the emerald pin I was wearing." "My hat, what a man you are!" exclaimed Rollinson. "But do you mean to say we are to give our concert in the dark?" "We will not have the afternoon sun blinding half our audience. We will have the auditorium in a cool twilight, and we will have lamplight on our platform. Just that mellow and flattering light in which elderly women look young, and young women angelic." "We'll leave everything to you," cried the curate. "I think we ought to leave him free scope. Ought we not, Mrs. Greswold?" Mildred assented. Pamela was enthusiastic. This concert was to be one of the events of her life. Castellani had discovered that she possessed a charming mezzo soprano. She was to sing a duet with him. Oh, what rapture! A duet of his own composition, all about roses and love and death. "'Twere sweet to die as the roses die, if I had but lived for thee. A life as long as the nightingale's song were enough for my heart and me." The words and the voices were interwoven in a melodious web. Tenor and soprano entwined together, following and over-following like the phrases in an anthem. The preparation of this one duet alone obliged Mr. Castellani to be nearly every day at Enderby. A musician has inexhaustible patience in teaching his own music. Castellani hammered at every bar and every note with Pamela. He did not hesitate at unpleasant truth. She had received the most expensive instruction from a well-known singing master, and, according to Castellani, everything she had been taught was wrong. "If you had been left alone to sing as the birds sing, you would be ever so much better off," he said. "The man has murdered a fine organ. If I had had the teaching of you, you would have sung as well as Trebelli by this time." Pamela thrilled at the thought. Oh, to sing like some great singer, to be able to soar skyward on the wings of music, to sing as he sang. She had known him a fortnight by this time, and was deeply in love with him. In moments of confidence by the piano he called her Pamela, treating her almost as if she were a child, yet with a touch of gallantry always, an air that said, "You are beautiful, dear child, and you know it, but I have lived my life." Before Mrs. Greswold he was more formal, and called her Miss Ransome. All barriers were down now between Riverdale and the Manor. Mrs. Hillersdon was going to make an extra large house party on purpose to patronize the concert. It was to be on the 7th of September. The partridge shooting would be in full swing, and the shooters assembled. Mrs. Greswold had been to tea at Riverdale. There seemed to be no help for it, and George Greswold was apparently indifferent. "My dearest, your purity of mind will be in no danger from Mrs. Hillersdon. Even were she still Louise Lorraine, She could not harm you, and you know I am not given to consider the qu'en in such a case. Let her come here by all means, so long as she is not obnoxious to you." " She is far from that. I think she has the most delightful manners of any woman I ever met." " So no doubt had Circe, yet she changed men into swine." " Mr. Canceller would not believe in her if she were not a good woman." " I should set a higher value on Canceller's opinion if he were more a man of the world and less of a bigot. See what nonsense he talked about the Deceased Wife's Sister's Bill." " Nonsense 1 O George, if you knew how it distressed me to hear you take the other side the unchristian side." " I can find no word of Christ's against such marriages, and the Church of old was always ready with a dispensation for any such union, if it was made worth the Church's while to be indulgent. It was the earnest desire of the Roman Catholic world that Philip should marry Elizabeth. You are Cancellor's pupil, Mildred, and I cannot wonder if he has made you something of a bigot." " He is the noblest and most unselfish of men." " I admit his unselfishness, the purity of his intentions, the tenderness of his heart ; but I deny his nobility. Ecclesiastic narrow mindedness spoils a character that might have been perfect had it been less hampered by tradition. Cancellor is a couple of centuries behind the time. His Church is the Church of Laud." " I thought you admired and loved him, George," said Mildred regretfully. " I admire his good qualities, I love him for his thoroughness, but our creeds are wide apart. I cannot even pretend to think as he thinks." This confession increased Mildred's sadness. She would have had her husband think as she thought, believe as she believed, in all spiritual things. The beloved child they had lost was waiting for them in heaven ; and she would fain that they should both tread the same path to that better world where there would be no more tears, no more death, where day and night would be alike in the light of the great throne. She shuddered at the thought of any difference of creed on her husband's part, shuddered at that beginning of divergence which might end in infidelity. She had been educated by Clement Canceller, and she thought as he thought. It seemed to her that she was surrounded by an atmosphere of doubt. In the books she read, among the more cultivated people whom she met, she found the same tendency to speculative infidelity, pessimism, Darwinism, sociology, pantheism, anything but Christian belief. The nearest approach to religious feeling seemed to be found in the Theosophists, with their last fashionable Oriental improvements upon the teaching of Christ. Clement Canceller had trained her in the belief that there was one Church, one creed, one sovereign rule of life, outside which rigid boundary line lay the dominion of Satan. And now, seeing her husband's antagonism to her pastor upon this minor point of the marriage law, she began to ask herself whether those two might not stand as widely apart upon graver questions : whether George Greswold might not be one of those half-hearted Christians who attend their parish church and keep Sunday sacred because it is well to set a good example to their neighbours and dependents, while their own faith is little more than a memory of youthful beliefs, the fading reflection of a sun that has sunk below the horizon. She had discovered her husband capable of a suppression of truth that was almost as bad as falsehood ; and now, having begun to doubt his consciousness, it was not unnatural that she would begin to doubt his religious feeling. " Had he been as deeply religious as I thought him, he would not have so deceived me," she told herself, still brooding upon that mystery of his first marriage. Castellani's presence in the house was a continual irritation to her. It tortured her to think that he knew more of her husband's past life than was known to her. She longed to question him, yet refrained, feeling that there would be unspeakable meanness, treachery even, in obtaining any information about her husband's past life except from his own lips. He had chosen to keep silence, he who could so easily have explained all things, and it was her duty to submit. She tried to be interested in the concert, which involved a good deal of work for herself, as she was to play all the accompaniments, the piano part in a concertante duet by De Beriot with an amateur violin player, and a Hungarian march by a modern classic by way of overture. There were rehearsals nearly every day, with much talking and tea drinking. Enderby Manor seemed to give over to bustle and gaiety that grave old house, which to her mind ought to have been silent as a sepulchre, now that Lola's voice could sound there never more, except in dreams. " People must think I am forgetting her," she said to herself with a sigh, when half a dozen carriages had driven away from the door, after 2 hours of bustle and confusion, much discussion as to the choice of songs and the arrangement of the programme, which everybody wanted different. " I cannot possibly sing the Three Fishers after Captain Scobell's Wanderer," protested Lady Millborough. " It would never do to have two dismal songs in succession." Yet when it was proposed to her that her ladyship's song should succeed Mr. Rollinson's admirable rendering of George Grossmith's " He was such a careless man," she distinctly refused to sing immediately after a comic song. " I am not going to take the taste of Mr. Rollinson's vulgarity out of people's mouths," she told Mildred, in an audible aside. To these God gifted vocalists the accompanist was as an inferior being, a person with a mere mechanical gift of playing anything set before her with taste and style. They treated her as if she had been a machine. " If you wouldn't mind going over our duet just once more, I think we should feel more comfortable in it," said one of the two Miss Tadcasters, who were to take the roof off, metaphorically, in the Norma duet. Mildred toiled with unwavering good nature, and suppressed her shudders at many a false note, and cast oil on the waters when the singers were inclined to quarrel. She was glad of the drudgery that kept her fingers and her mind occupied ; she was glad of any distraction that changed the current of her thoughts. It was the day before the concert. Cesar Castellani had established himself as l'ami de la maison, a person who had the right to come in and out as he liked, whose coming and going made no difference to the master of the house. Had George Greswold's mind been less abstracted from the business of everyday life, he might have seen danger to Pamela Ransom's peace of mind in the frequent presence of the Italian, and he might have considered it his duty, as the young lady's kinsman, to have restricted Mr. Castellani's privileges. But the blow which had crushed George Greswold's heart a little more than a year ago had left him in somewise a broken man. He had lost all interest in the common joys and occupations of everyday life. His days were spent for the most part in long walks or rides in the loneliest places he could find ; his only evening amusement was found in books, and those books of a kind which engrossed his attention and took him out of himself. His wife's companionship was always precious to him ; but their intercourse had lost all its old gaiety and much of the old familiarity. There was an indefinable something which held them asunder even when they were sitting in the same room, or pacing side by side, just as of old, upon the lawn in front of the drawing room, or idling in their summer parlour in the shade of the cedars. Again and again in the last 3 weeks some question about the past had trembled upon Mildred's lips as she sat at work by the piano where Castellani played in dreamy idleness, wandering from one master to another, or extemporising after his own capricious fancies. Again and again she had struggled against the temptation and had conquered. No, she would not stoop to a meanness. She would not be disloyal to her husband by so much as one idle question. To day Castellani was in high spirits, proud of to morrow's anticipated success, in which his own exertions would count for much. He sat at the piano in a leisure hour after tea. All the performers had gone, after the final adjustment of every detail. Mildred sat idle with her head resting against the cushion of a high backed armchair, exhausted by the afternoon's labours. Pamela stood by the piano, watching and listening delightedly as Castellani improvised. " I will give you my musical transcript of St. Partridge Day," he said, smiling down at the notes as he played a lively melody with little rippling runs in the treble and crisp staccato chords in the bass. " This is morning, and all the shooters are on tiptoe with delight a misty morning," gliding into a dreamy legato movement as he spoke. " You can scarcely see the hills yonder, and the sun is not yet up. See there he leaps above that bank of purple cloud in all his brightness," changing to crashing chords in the bass and brilliant arpeggios in the treble. " Hark ! There is Chanticleer. How shrill he peals in the morning air. The dogs are leaving the kennel, and now the gates are open, dogs and men are in the road. You can hear the steady tramp of the clumsy shooting boots, your dreadful English boots, and the merry music of the dogs. Pointers, setters, spaniels, smooth beasts and curly beasts, shaking the dew from the hedgerows as they scramble along the banks, flying over the ditches, creatures of lightning swiftness, yes, even those fat heavy spaniels which seem made to sprawl and snap at flies in the sunshine or snore beside the fire. He talked in brief snatches, playing all the time, playing with the easy brilliancy, the unerring grace of one to whom music is a native tongue as natural a mode of thought expression as speech itself. His father had trained him to improvise, weaving reminiscences of all his favourite composers into those dreamy reveries. They had sat side by side, father and son, each following the bent of his own fancy, yet quick to adapt it to the other, now leading, now following. They had played together as Michaelides and Mendelssohn used to play, delighting in each other's caprices. " I hope I don't bore you very much," said Castellani, looking up at Mildred as she sat silent, the fair face and pale gold hair defined against the olive brocade of the chair cushion. He looked up at her in wondering admiration, as at a beautiful picture. How lovely she was, with a loveliness that grew upon him and took possession of his fancy and his senses with a strengthening hold day by day. It was a melancholy loveliness, the beauty of a woman whose life had come to a dead stop, in whose breast hope and love were dead, or dormant. Not dead, he told himself, only sleeping. Who shall be the spell to awaken the sleeper ? Who shall be the Orpheus to bring the sweet Eurydice from the realms of death ? Such thoughts were in his mind as he sat looking at her, waiting for her answer, playing all the while, telling her how fair she was in the tenderest variations of an old German air whose every note breathed passionate love. " How sweet !" murmured Pamela. " What an exquisite melody !" taking some of the sweetness to herself. " How could such music weary any one with the ghost of an ear ? You are not bored by it, are you, aunt ?"" Bored ? No, it is delightful," answered Mildred, rousing herself from a reverie. " My thoughts went back to my childhood while you were playing. I never knew but one other person who had that gift of improvisation, and she used to play to me when I was a child. She was almost a child herself, and of course she was very inferior to you as a pianist ; but she would sit and play for me for an hour in the twilight, inventing new melodies, or playing recollections of old melodies, describing in music. The old fairy tales are for ever associated with music in my mind because of those memories. I believe she was highly gifted in music." " Music of a high order is not an uncommon gift among women of sensitive temperament," said Castellani musingly. " I take it to be only another name for sympathy. Want of musical feeling is want of sympathy. Shakespeare knew that when he declared the non musical man to be by nature a villain. I could no more imagine you without the gift of music than I could imagine the stars without the quality of light. Mr. Greswold's first wife was a good musician, as you no doubt know." " You heard her play and sing ?" faltered Mildred, avoiding a direct reply. The sudden mention of her dead rival's name had quickened the beating of her heart. She had longed to question him and had refrained ; and now, without any act of hers, he had spoken, and she was going to hear something about that woman whose existence was a mystery to her, whose Christian name she had never heard. " Yes, I heard her several times at parties at Nice. She was much admired for her musical talents. She was not a grand singer, but she had been well taught, and she had exquisite taste, and knew exactly the kind of music that suited her best. She was one of the attractions at the Palais Montano, where one heard only the best music." " I think you said the other day that you did not meet her often," said Mildred. " My husband could hardly have forgotten you had met frequently." " I can scarcely say that we met frequently, and our meetings were such as Mr. Greswold would not be very likely to remember. I am not a remarkable man now, and I was a very insignificant person 15 years ago. I was only asked to people's houses because I could sing a little, and because my father had a reputation in the South as a composer. I was never introduced to your husband, but I was presented to his wife as a precocious youth with some pretensions to a tenor voice, and I found her very charming, after her own particular style." " Was she a beautiful woman ?" asked Mildred. " I have never talked about her to my husband. She died so young, and "" Yes, yes, I understand," interrupted Castellani, as she hesitated. " Of course you would not speak of her. There are things that cannot be spoken about. There is always a skeleton in every life, not more in Mr. Greswold's past than in that of other people, perhaps, could we know all histories. I was wrong to speak of her. Her name escaped me unawares." " Pray don't apologise," said Mildred, indignant at something in his tone which hinted at wrong doing on her husband's part. " There can be no reason why you should keep silence to me though any mention of an old sorrow might wound him. I know my husband too well not to know that he must have behaved honourably in every relation of life, before I married him as well as afterwards. I only asked a very simple question. Was my predecessor as beautiful as she was gifted ? No. She was charming, piquant, elegant, spiritual, but she was not handsome. I think she was conscious of that want of beauty, and that it made her sensitive and even bitter. I have heard her say hard things of women who were handsomer than herself. She had a scathing tongue and a capricious temper, and she was not a favourite with her own sex, though she was very much admired by clever men. I know that as a lad I thought her one of the brightest women I had ever met." " It was sad that she should die so young," said Mildred. She would not for worlds that this man should know the extent of her ignorance about the woman who had borne her husband's name. She spoke vaguely, hoping that he would take it for granted she knew all. " Yes," assented Castellani with a sigh, " her death was infinitely sad." He spoke as of an event of more than common sadness, a calamity that had been in somewise more tragical than untimely death must needs be. Mildred kept silence, though her heart ached with shapeless forebodings, and though it would have been an unspeakable relief to know the worst rather than to feel the oppression of this mystery. Castellani rose to take leave. He was paler than he had been before the conversation began, and he had a troubled air. Pamela looked at him with sympathetic distress. " I am afraid you are dreadfully tired," she said, as they shook hands. " I am never tired in this house," he answered ; and Pamela appropriated the compliment by her vivid blush. Mildred shook hands with him mechanically and in silence. She was hardly conscious of his leaving the room. She rose and went out into the garden, while Pamela sat down to the piano and began singing her part in the everlasting duet. She never sang anything else nowadays. It was a perpetual carol of admiration for the author of Nepenthe. " 'Twere sweet to die as the roses die, If I had but lived for thee ; 'Twere sweet to fade as the twilight fades Over the western sea," she warbled, while Mildred paced slowly to and fro in front of the cedars, brooding over every word Castellani had spoken about her husband's first wife. Her death was infinitely sad. Why infinitely ? The significance of the word troubled her. It conjured up all manner of possibilities. Why infinitely sad ? All death is sad. The death of the young especially so. But to say even of a young wife's death that it was infinitely sad would seem to lift it out of the region of humanity's common doom. That qualifying word hinted at a tragical fate rather than a young life cut short by any ordinary malady. There had been something in Castellani's manner which accentuated the meaning of his words. That troubled look, that deep sigh, that hurried departure, all hinted at a painful story which she knew and did not wish to reveal. He had in a manner apologised for speaking of George Greswold's first wife. There must have been a reason for that. He was not a man to say meaningless things out of gaucherie ; not a man to blunder and equivocate from either shyness or stupidity. He had implied that Mr. Greswold was not likely to talk about his first marriage ; that he would naturally avoid any allusion to his first wife. Why naturally ? Why should he not speak of that past life ? Men are not ordinarily reticent upon such subjects. And that a man should suppress the fact of a first marriage altogether would suggest memories so dark as to impel an honourable man to stoop to a tacit lie rather than face the horror of revelation. She walked up and down that fair stretch of velvet turf upon which her feet had trodden so lightly in the happy years that were gone gone never to be recalled, as it seemed to her, carrying with them all she had ever known of domestic peace, of wedded bliss. Never again could they two be as they had been. The mystery of the past had risen up between them, like some hooded phantom, a vaguely threatening figure, a hidden face, to hold them apart for evermore. " If he had only trusted me," she thought despairingly, " there is hardly any sin that I would not have forgiven for love of him. Why could he not believe in my love well enough to know that I should judge him leniently if there had been wrong doing on his side if She had puzzled over that hidden past, trying to penetrate the darkness, imagining the things that might have happened infidelity on the wife's part, infidelity on the husband's side, another and fatal attachment taking the place of loyal love. Sin of some kind there must have been, she thought, for such dark memories could scarcely be sinless ; but was husband or wife the sinner ? Her death was infinitely sad. That sentence stood out against the dark background of mystery as if written in fire. That one fact was absolute. George Greswold's first wife had died under circumstances of peculiar sadness so painful that Castellani's countenance grew pale and troubled at the very thought of her death. " I cannot endure it," Mildred thought at last, in an agony of doubt. I will not suffer this torture for another day. I will appeal to him. I will question him. If he values my love and my esteem he will answer faithfully. It must be painful for him, painful for me. But it will be far better for us both in the long run. Anything will be better than these torturing fears. I am his wife, and I have a right to know the truth." The dressing gong summoned her back to the house. Her husband was in the drawing room half an hour afterwards when she went down to dinner. He was still in his jacket and knickerbockers, just as he had come in from a long ramble. " Will you forgive me if I dine with you in these clothes, Mildred, and you, Pamela ?" to the damsel in white muslin whom he had just surprised at the piano, still warbling her honeyed strain about death and the roses. " I came in 5 minutes ago, dead beat. I have been in the forest, and had a tramp with the deerhounds over Bramble Hill." " You walked too far, George. You are looking dreadfully tired." " I'm sure you needn't apologize for your dress on my account," said Pamela. " Henry is a perfect disgrace half his time. He hates evening clothes, and I sometimes fear he hates soap and water. He can reconcile his conscience to any amount of dirt so long as he has his cold tub in the morning. He thinks that one sacrifice to decency justifies anything. I have had to sit next him at dinner when he came straight from rats," concluded Pamela with a shudder. " But Rosalind is so foolishly indulgent. She would spoil 20 husbands." " And you, I suppose, would be a martinet to one ?" said Greswold, smiling at the girl's animated face. " It would depend. If I were married to an artist I could forgive any neglect of the proprieties. One does not expect a man of that kind to be the slave of conventionalities ; but a commonplace person like Sir Henry Mountford has nothing to recommend him but his tailor." They went to dinner, and Pamela's prattle relieved the gloom which had fallen upon husband and wife. George Greswold saw that there were signs of a new trouble in his wife's face. He sat for nearly an hour alone with the untouched decanters before him, and with Kassandra's head upon his knee. The dog always knew when his thoughts were darkest, and would not be repulsed at such times. She was not obtrusive. She only wanted to bear him company. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he left the dining room. He looked in at the drawing room door, and saw his wife and his niece sitting at work, silent both. " I am going to the library to write some letters, Mildred," he said. " Don't sit up for me." She rose quickly and went over to him. " Let me have half an hour's talk with you first, George," she said in an earnest voice. " I want so much to speak to you." " My dearest, I am always at your service," he answered quietly ; and they went across the hall together to that fine old room which was essentially the domain of the master of the house. It was a large room with 3 long narrow windows, unaltered from the days of Queen Anne, looking out to the carriage drive in the front of the house, and the walls were lined with books in severely architectural bookcases. There was a lofty marble chimney piece, richly decorated, and in front of the fireplace there was an old fashioned knee hole desk, at which Mr. Greswold was wont to sit. There was a double reading lamp ready lighted for him upon his desk, and there was no other light in the room. By this dim light the sombre colouring of oak bookcases and maroon velvet window curtains deepened to black. The spacious room had almost a funereal aspect, like that awful banqueting hall to which Domitian invited his parasites and straightway frightened them to death. " Well, Mildred, what is the matter ?" asked Greswold, when his wife had seated herself beside him in front of the massive oak desk, at which all the business of his estate had been transacted since he came to Enderby. " There is nothing amiss, love, I hope, to make you so earnest." " There is something very much amiss, George," she answered. " Forgive me if I pain you by what I have to say by the questions I am going to ask. I cannot help giving you pain, truly and dearly as I love you. I cannot go on suffering as I have suffered since that wretched Sunday afternoon when I discovered how you had deceived me you whom I so trusted, so honoured as the most upright among men." " It is a little hard that you should say I deceived you, Mildred. I suppressed one fact which had no bearing upon my relations with you." " O George, I know how true you are how true and upright you have been in every word and act of your life since we two have been one. It is not in my nature to misjudge you. I cannot think you capable of wrong doing to any one under strongest temptation. I cannot believe that fate could set such a snare for you as could entrap you into one dishonourable act. But I am tortured by the thought of a past life of which I know nothing. Why did you hide your marriage from me when we were lovers ? Why are you silent and secret now, when I am your wife, the other half of yourself, ready to sympathise with you, to share the burden of dark memories? Trust me, George. Trust me, dear love, and let us be again as we have been, united in every thought." "You do not know what you are asking me, Mildred," said George Greswold, in his deep, grave voice, looking at her with haggard, reproachful eyes. "You cannot measure the torture you are inflicting by this aimless curiosity." "You cannot measure the agony of doubt which I have suffered since I knew that you loved another woman before you loved me, loved her so well that you cannot bear even to speak of that past life which you lived with her, regret her so intensely that now, after 14 years of wedded life with me, the mere memory of that lost love can plunge you into gloom and despair," said Mildred passionately. That smothered fire of jealousy which had been smouldering in her breast for weeks broke out all at once in impetuous speech. She no longer cared what she said. Her only thought was that the dead love had been dearer than the living, that she had been cozened by a lover whose heart had never been wholly hers. "You are very cruel, Mildred," her husband answered quietly. "You are probing an old wound, and a deep one, to the quick. You wrong yourself more than you wrong me by causeless jealousy and unworthy doubts. Yes, I did conceal the fact of my first marriage, not because I had loved my wife too well, but because I had not loved her well enough. I was silent about a period of my life which is one of intense misery, which it was my duty to myself to forget, if it were possible to forget, which it was perilous to remember. My only chance of happiness or peace of mind lay in oblivion of that bitter time. It was only when I loved you that I began to believe forgetfulness was possible. I courted oblivion by every means in my power. I told myself that the man who had so suffered was a man who had ceased to exist. George Ransome was dead. George Greswold stood on the threshold of a new life, with infinite capacities for happiness. I told myself that I might be a beloved and honoured husband, which I had never been, a useful member of society, which I had not been hitherto. Until that hour all things had been against me. With you for my wife all things would be in my favour. For 13 happy years this promise of our marriage morning was fully realized. Then came our child's death, and now comes your estrangement." "I am not estranged, George. It is only my dread of the beginning of estrangement which tortures me. Since that man spoke of your first wife, I have brooded perpetually upon that hidden past. It is weak, I know, to have done so. I ought to trust you unquestioningly, but I cannot. I love you too well to love without jealousy." "Well, let the veil be lifted then, since it must be so. Ask what questions you please, and I will answer them, as best I can." "You are very good," she faltered, drawing a little nearer to him, leaning her head against his shoulder as she talked to him, and laying her hand on his as it lay before him on the desk, tightly clenched. "Tell me, dear, were you happy with your first wife?" "I was not." "Not even in the beginning?" "Hardly in the beginning. It was an ill advised union, the result of impulse." "But she loved you very dearly, perhaps?" "She loved me dearly, after her manner of loving." "And you did not love her?" "It is a cruel thing you force me to say, Mildred. No, I did not love her." "Had you been married long when she died?" She felt a quivering movement in the clenched hand on which her own lay caressingly, and she heard him draw a long and deep breath. "About a year." "Her death was a sad one, I know. Did she go out of her mind before she died?" "No." "Did she leave you, or do you any great wrong?" "No." "Were you false to her? George, oh, forgive me, forgive me! But there must have been something more sad than common sadness, and it might be that some new and fatal love " "There was no such thing," he answered sternly. "I was true to my duties as a husband. It was not a long trial, only a year. Even a profligate might keep faith for so short a span." "I see you will not confide in me. I will ask no more questions, George. That kind of catechism will not make us more in sympathy with each other. I will ask you nothing more, except just one question, a woman's question. Was your first wife beautiful in your eyes?" "She was not beautiful, but she was intellectual, and she had an interesting countenance, a face that attracted me at first sight. It was even more attractive to me than the faces of handsomer women. But if you want to know what your fancied rival was like, you need not languish in ignorance," with some touch of scorn. " I have her photograph in this desk. I have kept it for my days of humiliation, to remind me of what I have been and what I may be again. Would you like to see it ?"" Yes, George, if it will not pain you too much to show it to me." " Do not talk of pain. You have stirred the waters of Mara so deeply that one bitter drop cannot signify." He unlocked his desk as he spoke, lifted the lid, which was sustained by a movable upright, and groped among the accumulation of papers and parchments inside. The object for which he was seeking was at the back of the desk, under all the papers. He found it by touch a morocco case containing a cabinet photograph. Mildred stood up beside him, with one hand on his shoulder, as he searched. He handed her the case without a word. She opened it in silence, and looked at the portrait within. A small, delicately featured face, with large dark eyes almost too large for the face a slender throat, thin sloping shoulders, eyes that looked out of the picture with a strange intensity, a curious alertness in the countenance, as of a woman made up of nerves and emotions, a nature wanting the element of repose. Mildred stared at the picture 3 or 4 seconds, and then, with a choking sound like a strangled sob, fell unconscious at her husband's feet. End of Project Gutenberg's Book 1.